Now for our What in the World segment. I was struck by a piece of news recently that is good for America, shows that our politicians are learning from their mistakes and are actually cooperating with each other on both sides of the aisle. Sounds too good to be true? Well, listen in. For many years, the United States has had a growing problem in its criminal justice system. As I've pointed out before, we are #1 in the world when it comes to incarceration, by far. In 2009, for example, for every 100,000 citizens, 760 Americans were in prison. That was 5 times the rate of incarceration in Britain, 8 times the rate in Germany and South Korea, and 12 times the rate in Japan. This trend began about 40 years ago. In 1970, state prisons had a combined total of 174,000 inmates. By 2009, they had 1.4 million, an 8-fold increase. And these correctional systems cost a lot of money, of course, nearly $80 billion a year, more than the entire GDP of Croatia or Tunisia. Well, it seems that finally common sense is prevailing.
Thank you.
Attorney General Eric Holder made an important speech this week, admitting that our prisons are overcrowded and costly. He specifically called for a reduction in mandatory sentences for low-level drug offenders.
Will no longer be charged with offenses that impose draconian mandatory minimum sentences.
It's important the Attorney General brought up drugs because the numbers are startling. Federal prisons, the group Holder was referring to, account for about 14% of our total inmates. In these prisons, the most serious charge for nearly half of all inmates is a drug offense. Compare that with state prisons, where only 20% of the inmates have a drug offense as their most serious charge. Now, here's what's interesting. The federal prison population has increased every single year since 1980. On the other hand, state prison populations have been declining in recent years, so much so that the overall number of inmates, state plus federal, is actually down in each of the past 3 years. And here's the best part. The declines encompass 28 states, red and blue. Part of these declines are because budgets were simply collapsing. But it could also be because of a growing acknowledgement that the war on drugs has failed. According to the Pro-Reform Drug Policy Alliance, the United States spends about $50 billion a year on the drug war, adding up to $1 trillion in the last 4 decades. But there has been no real change in addiction rates. Americans are not more prone to drugs or crime than citizens of other countries, so why should we put so many people in prison? Well, the good news is that the numbers are finally too large to ignore. The states are already acting, and Holder's comments will add momentum to a growing chorus for reform.
This isn't just unacceptable, it is shameful.
The greatest challenge in pushing these numbers further down will be the prison lobby. Believe it or not, many of our prisons are run by private companies that then lobby state legislatures massively for bigger prisons, larger budgets, and of course, more prisoners. According to the nonprofit Justice Policy Institute, the 2 largest private prison companies in America together generate revenues of $3 billion a year, paid by taxpayers, of course. These private prison companies also happen to be major donors to a number of state campaigns, lobbying for more resources. If our politicians can take on the prison lobbies, there really is hope for America.